Welcome to the Tank Museum, to this live stream event. My name is David Willey. I'm the curator here at the Tank Museum, and I'm joined by my very good friend Richard Cutland from World of Tanks, who are sponsoring this event. And very appropriately, Richard is ex-Royal Tank Regiment and used to be a tank commander.
We'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all of you that support the Tank Museum through Patreon. Without your generosity, events like this simply couldn't happen.
So what we're going to be doing for you for this live stream event, I'm going to take Richard on a bit of a tour to see some of the highlights of the displays.
And like you at home, this is the first time I would have seen it, so I actually can't wait, David.
And then we're going to join some of the veterans and their families to ask some questions. And we're going to be given an address by His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent, who is our patron. And to start the ball rolling, we have a veteran who sadly couldn't be joining us live today, but he will be watching this broadcast, Ken Tout, and he's going to open our World War II War Stories exhibition with this introduction.
I'm Ken Tout. I served with the Northamptonshire Yeomanry from June 1943 to November 1945. Thousands of British and Commonwealth men served in armoured regiments in the Second World War. We fought our vehicles from the battlefields of Europe to the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma. We fought to secure freedom from oppression. Over 11,000 men of the Royal Armoured Corps lost their lives in that conflict. This exhibition is our story.
So, David, here we are, brand new exhibition. The first thing that strikes me is it looks a little bit more spacious, perhaps, than it was before.
Yeah, actually, I know everyone's always worried because if you're interested in the tanks, we've got fewer tanks on display. In fact, we've actually got the same number that we used to have in this World War II hall. But the key thing that we want to come across, the displays are done because of the evidence we've had by interviewing our audience that comes here. They're mainly a family audience, and one of the things they've been very keen on, they want to know about the personal stories, the veteran stories, and they want to know about the battles that the soldiers have actually fought in. So what we've done with the new displays, we've kept those vehicles there, there's still the same number of tanks, but we've brought in personal stories, veterans accounts, and we've been so lucky because we've had that opportunity of interviewing those guys in their 90s telling us what it was like for them looking back at their lives.
I noticed the mannequins down there as well.
Yeah, so again, back to, you need photo opportunities if you're coming round with a family. So 3 guys, you can join them, be the family, you know, the crew as it were, all together. And what we've done in this space, bit of an introduction, we've got some of the equipment, you might even recognise some.
I noticed the mess tins and the cooker there as well. So
yeah, so some of the things that they were equipping with, the clothing they were wearing, you know, the tank suits. You were issued with a tank suit?
Yeah, very, very dear to our heart, the tank uniforms.
Nice and warm inside a cold
cuddly,
vehicle. Yeah. And what we've also got, we start with the Matilda 1, the infantry tank, and we move on to the Comet, the cruiser tank that we were using at the end of the war. So that idea of the technology speeding through in World War II. So as we come into this space, we try and set a scene for the visitor. So we've got a theatre there, a film theatre showing a film that gives you that idea. What was Britain like in '39 with the war coming, etc. We've got a home front house, the shop. That's because school kids are still doing home front, so it's really good for us to do. And some of those vehicles from the early war, the emergency, well, our Rolls Royce, built in 1921, was patrolling the coast of Northumberland, you know, exactly. So Beaverette, early war emergency vehicle. We've picked on battles in particular. We've tried to go for battles that are not the ones that everybody always talks about. So in this area, we've got the Battle of Arras. We also bring to attention some of the veteran stories you might like to look out for as you go around. We'll be seeing some of these chaps a little bit later on. But the idea of not always dwelling on the same thing. So you'll know about the Battle of Arras in 1940.
Battle honours, of course. Yeah.
Absolutely, but not everyone does. You know, an important engagement that sees a small British armoured force. It's a complete mess on the day, but boy, does it have an effect against the Germans. And for that battle in particular, what we're keen on is we tell a story here of Peter Vorks, who's this young man who is in a light 6B tank. He's part of this attack against a German armoured force. The battle ends. He's still in his tank. He tries to, they're told a rendezvous point. They basically get lost. And him and his driver, Robert Burrows, who's on the other side of the display here, they go on this sort of like boy's own adventure behind the German lines. They take the compass from the vehicle when it runs out of petrol. So there's this compass that he actually uses, and they find their way back to Allied lines. They are on the run for 11 days. All sorts of dramas happen to them. But sadly, when they go to cross the River Somme to get to the French forces on the other side, Robert Burrows gets swept downstream and he drowns. Now, Peter Vorks, who for us, when we spoke to him many moons ago, he saw a lot of action in World War II, and one of the things he says is he was most frightened when he was standing outside Robert Burrows, the family had met to hear the story of how their son had been lost. He was going to knock on the door and explain that to them. And it's, for me, it's one of those really moving stories about whatever we talk about, the equipment, etc. These are all personal stories in the end for what these guys go through. So a lovely object from our point of view. Another one of our veterans that we talk about, Alf Longstaff, he wins a medal in the Arras battle. And with some of these characters, it's how not only are they in one engagement, but again, he fights in the desert later on. He's the driver of somebody who wins a VC, Bob Foote, also Royal Tank Regiment. And his story, again, the fact that he escapes from prison. When you read and you learn about these people's stories, it is like you're reading the old Front of the Victor comic. You know, you can't with these true stories, but they are, and that's what we want to share with the public. So as you come around,
this Matilda 2 rings a bell somewhere.
Yeah, I was going to say this one you might recognise. This particular Matilda 2, it used to be a gate guard up at your guys at Tidworth. Yep. We've repainted it. We've done it in the scheme, what they call the Caunter scheme, which was a camouflage scheme. And this battle we talk about is Operation Compass. It's when a very small British force with some tanks manage about 20,000 men. They absolutely decimate an enormous Italian army of about 250,000 men. And again, it's a battle early in the war we tend to forget about. But our tanks at the time, the Matilda, was known as Queen of the Desert. So this myth that we, you know, our own tanks are always rubbish, you know, we like trying to sort of change that myth.
Like you said earlier as well, I mean, Operation Compass, not something people
no,
really
it's
aware
not, you know,
of
and it's because it gets overlooked. We always hear about Blitzkrieg. We forget that Britain was quite good at this at certain times as well. So we talk about here, we've got a chap called Jock Watt, tells an amazing story on camera to us, how he gets out in Greece, managed to get a ship, crosses the Mediterranean. Jock was a great guy interviewing, and again, those personal stories, being able to sort of tell you a little bit more about what it was like. And here we talk about Operation Crusader, some of the things going on in the desert, some of the images, you know, the things that people were having to put up with out there.
What's with the beer bottles, David?
So the beer bottles, we've done this in particular because we talk about one particular veteran who did a fantastic diary, Jake Wardrop. Now we use his diary throughout the displays, and Jake's a bit of a character. He's one of these guys, he gets up to sergeant, gets busted down again, gets a bit in a fight, everything, but the CO of his unit says, if I'm going into battle, I want Jake with me, type of thing. And there's some lovely accounts of how in the middle of the desert, they're saving up the odd bottle of beer here and there, and he's in an engagement one time. The tank is knocked out, and this is, after all this battle, everything out, this is what he puts in the diary. The cruelest blow of all was the smashing of a bottle of whiskey belonging to the commander. So, you know, these little things like that, but he's a character we pick up on in a number of places.
Not, of course, that we'd ever have alcohol in tanks.
You're not allowed that as well. Yeah, of course you don't. No, that sort of stuff.
I noticed there's a few interactive displays as we go around, David.
Yeah, the issue with interactives, you can imagine, with COVID at the moment, we are having to follow government guidelines. We have a lot of interactivity within the galleries, but the issue we've got, of course, is what you can touch and what you can't at the moment. Now here we've got that overused word iconic, but for me, you know, a fantastic display. This is the flag that flew over Tobruk during the siege, and below it we've got a captured German swastika banner. This was captured by the 8th Royal Tank Regiment. It was taken out the locker that was on a 88mm anti-tank gun. And you'll know this sort of story. You know, capturing a flag is so important, it's so symbolic. But what we've got here is a number of the soldiers. Their names are actually written, and one of the soldiers' wives embroidered their names on the flag, and they also put some of the battles they fought on. So this is these soldiers really trying to sort of, you know, we were there, they want to be memorialised, and what a great symbol as well. So for us, you know, that was the flag of liberty and freedom, lots of different nations fighting under it at the time in that siege of Tobruk, and there is what they were defeating, that flag is of Nazi fascism. So, you know, that's why we wanted to get those two out there. And you know the controversy about flags at the moment, what a great flag story.
It's incredible to have all of it in the museum. That's so emotive when you see something
and it
like
is
that.
still, and you've been into action, you've fought, what are you fighting for?
Yeah.
And in the end, it's very confusing sometimes for many people, but ultimately the flag is a symbol, you know, for everything in a way, and that's why I think that's an important one. And it was Jean Robinson, whose picture's there. She was the person that did the embroidery, and again, it's all part of that, back to a family effort of memorialising what the guys did. So we come around here, we talk a bit about Dieppe. Here we've got a dingo, that's the oldest Churchill remaining in the world. Dieppe was really a Canadian event in terms of armour, but it was so important because it led to great lessons being learnt that we'll see in D-Day. So we thought that was really worth putting in. We talk about Tunisia. Some of the vehicles you'll recognise, you know, they're very familiar ones if you come to the museum. Other ones, you know, you were saying earlier, you know, sometimes you just don't quite recognise.
Yeah, I think we'll see one later on. Actually, there was one vehicle. I said, I swear, David, that's never been here before.
Yeah, they've been here. And what we're doing is we're repainting a number of the vehicles to match the battles we're now sort of putting them in, as it were, so they reflect the units and what was going on at the time. Now, as we come through this area, we're doing something on the Battle of the Admin Box in Burma.
And this is another one, which, let's be honest, very few people are aware of this.
I think, you know we had an army with Tom Moore recently, the fact that people knew about the Burma campaign, but the fact tanks were there. So we've got this is our Japanese Hargo tank. We've also got a bridge layer there, which is a Valentine bridge layer. I'd be honest, at the beginning of this, I didn't realise we'd taken bridge layers out to the Far East, but, you know, so again, we're quite keen to tell that bit of the story, because for us as well, again, it's these bits of the battles, and we've got a video screen here, and you can do an interactive. Most people will still find it hard to find Burma on the map. So it's, you know, you imagine the poor guys fighting there, the other side of the world, no wonder they thought they were the forgotten army, but we're trying to bring them back in. Now here we've got some of our D-Day vehicles. So that Churchill tank is a prime example of the lessons we learned from Dieppe earlier on. We need infantry support, we need specialised armour. This has got this whopping great petard mortar on it that was used for blowing up seawalls, pillboxes. And we've got here one of the airborne tanks that are landed in a glider. That's not a packing case, that's part of a glider that they land behind the lines on D-Day. That's quite
incredible when you look at it.
It is, you know, imagine flying off in that, you know, and you're going to land in a tank on a glider. And we've got a lovely story here. Ian Hamilton, that's his helmet that he was in a flail tank in Normandy. And again, back to, if we can personalise the tank and tell you the story about that, so we get that idea of the understanding. Now into this area, into the Battle of Normandy area, we have a big screen up here where a number of our veterans, Charlie Burgess, a number of people, Ernest Slarks, we'll talk to Ernest later, we can tell their stories on that screen, and they're talking about lots of different elements that come into play, because Normandy, for the Royal Armoured Corps, it's the biggest tank battles they face. And they're up against some of the monsters like this German King Tiger we put here. This is a German reconnaissance vehicle called a Lux. Both these vehicles were actually captured in Normandy, and we've got one of the German armoured cars, big 8-wheeler here. And for us, this is one of those bits where the veterans filling in the gaps. What was it like? What did you feel like? We've done those stories there, and one of the Normandy stories I particularly find really important because, yes, you know, tanks like this huge King Tiger, but small items can have a punch as well. And I was talking to you earlier, you know, what were the things that when you went off to fight, did you have the photo in the wallet? Did you have something in the family? Something that just reminds you of home?
Yeah, anything, like you say, anything to remind you of home. Photos, very poignant, of course, but I also recall, you know, when we deployed to Iraq, my son was quite small at the time, quite young, and I remember taking one of his very small teddies with me as well, which I kept, you know, close to my heart throughout the whole thing, may I say.
So that idea of the personal items, so in this area we were really lucky. We had a chap called Bill Bellamy who told us his story, he wrote his memoir later. Bill was about to go off and fight in Normandy, and his girlfriend gave him a little doll called Audrey. Now, Bill put that on the side of his tank. It was like the good luck charm. And they're going into action in Normandy. They drive their tank through one of these bocage hedgerows. Audrey is brushed off the side of the tank. Now, the tank following sees this, radios ahead to Bill's tank and said, "You've lost Audrey." And Bill doesn't say a word, but the driver stops instantly. They're under fire from the Germans. The loader gets out the turret, runs back, picks up Audrey, runs forward, puts Audrey back onto the tank, and not a word is said by the crew, but off they go again in action and go in the fight, because they knew without Audrey they were in danger. And the lovely thing is, Bill's family have lent us Audrey, and there she is, as that, again, small, not that important, you would have thought, an object, until you know the story behind her. That lovely little bit about, there we are, that was some guy's good luck charm that saw him through the wall.
Yeah, and delicate as well. I mean, surviving on a tank, I'm quite...
Yeah, amazing, isn't it, sort of thing. But everyone, you know, so many people, they'll tell you what they had. You said about the, you know, I interviewed a veteran from Afghanistan. He said he's under fire and he's got his kid's Care Bear and he's smelling it because he just thinks, you know, just that idea, anything of home. So Jake, again, we talk about Jake Wardrop in a number of places. Jake sees a lot of action. His diary is such an amazing source of great material, you know, to finding out what it was like. And then we move on in terms of area. Here we are with our, what we're calling the Great Swan. It's basically a lineup of some of the vehicles as they were when they were heading off after that Normandy fighting. We do the breakout, we cross the River Seine, and it's General Montgomery, obviously, you know, for many people, the very cautious general, but he's the guy that is telling the guys to race on, race on, race on. And here you can see on the ground.
Yeah, this is fantastic. The significance of the mileage they were travelling in short periods of time is quite incredible.
Yeah, you know, they go further and faster in that Great Swan advance than the Germans did in 1940. We always hear about Blitzkrieg, we don't hear ourselves about doing it the same way. So this lineup of vehicles, we've got our M10 tank destroyer, we've got a, you know, what we often call the bog standard Sherman. So many British soldiers were fighting in with a 75mm gun. We've got a scout car. The issue is, of course, is so often we only see a tank on its own in the museum. They were, of course, fighting together with many other vehicles. So the idea here is trying to give that opportunity of a lovely lineup. And we tell the stories on the video screen here of that sense of all of a sudden the Armoured Corps was doing what it felt it was trained for, which is exploitation, going quickly, getting all the way ahead, and you know, with Montgomery behind them, pushing them on, saying, come on, don't let the Germans stop, you know, don't let them get back together again. So as we come around this corner, we talk a bit about what we call the Gothic line, the Italian campaign, that slog that goes on as they're fighting their way up Italy. Again, a lot of the soldiers that fought in Italy, many nations fight together, you know, we've got Czechs, Poles, Canadians, we've got Indian troops.
I was going to say, the AEC was the one I was sort of, you know,
I
swear that was never here before.
It's been on display. It's in the unit markings of an Indian regiment that's fighting in Italy. So, you know, again, it's a big story we're trying to represent here. And the Italian campaign, again, is, you know, some of the guys thought they were a bit of a sideshow, they were forgotten about sometimes, but, you know, the fighting that goes on is quite extensive. We've got a German Sturmgeschütz there as well, and on loan from the Churchill Trust, this wonderful Churchill 4 tank, and some of the students from the Arts University at Bournemouth, they've made us, in the model making course, they've made us some lovely dummies to crew it, so people can start looking in and see, you know, is that the space you find? Yeah, exactly, yeah, with the guy smoking his pipe there. So as we come round this corner, we talk here a little bit about the Battle of Walcheren, but just before leaving Italy, one of the things that Jake Wardrop, why we love his diary so much, is he's got great descriptions. But one of the other things he does is he writes home. And again, you know, when you went off to fight, did you write the letter in case
you
type
do.
of thing?
It's incredibly hard because, to be perfectly honest, you don't want to tempt fate, obviously, to start with. But and there's so much you want to say to, you know, your parents, your family, your loved ones, and everything else. But you're never really sure what to sort of put down and make it, not to upset them, of course. But yeah, most people do write.
If
something.
we can get you, just read that one. This is what Jake actually writes from himself. He's in Italy at the time and he writes to his mum.
I'm not afraid, and nor have I lost my nerve. I'm a tank commander, and I shall continue to be one until the end. I've played the game, and it seemed to me the right way to play it. What the end will be, I don't know. Who am I to say? So that is all, Mother. Try to get the idea, and I think you'll understand. Cheerio. I'll be seeing you. Will.
It's great stuff, and I just think some of these, we've got them all around the galleries, you know, the personal bit of the story. But for somebody like Jake as well, and so sadly as well, he is killed before the end of the war. And when we're talking about this as we go along, one of the things we're very conscious of as well is back to that personal experience. What were people up to? I mean, as we go through here, as you look down the other end, we've got the vehicles that were fighting towards the end of the war as they're going into Germany. Symbolically, we cross the Rhine as we go over here. We talk about here the meeting, east and west, so we've got a T-34. We're not telling everybody's story, but the T-34 is purposely there to mention that idea about, you know, the Russian front, where, let's be honest, that's where the casualties are. So much of that fighting is going on in terms of World War II tank warfare. But on the other side of it as well, David Render, who I know you had the pleasure of meeting.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
Fantastic guy. I met him a number of times. But he talks on this particular area where we interviewed him about one of the things that really affected him is a great mate of his, Harry Heinen, who sadly is killed. And he tells that story and how that affects him as well for the rest of his life, you know. And I think that's another thing we're really conscious of is this is not just a one big happy story. There's lots of elements to it, and every individual soldiers, you know, they went through very different experiences, and what they took with them was different as well. So as we move on, we're coming towards the end of the war period. One thing we've purposely done, you know, we've got the Germans are coming up with more and more sophisticated vehicles. Here's a Jagdpanther towards the end of the war there. But you were just as likely to be knocked out by somebody or with a Panzerfaust on a bicycle. So for the Allied tank crews, you know, as you're coming to the end there, nobody wants to be the last soldier to die in Europe, sort of thing. So we're putting that, trying to show that peculiar sort of range of things that these guys are up against. And then as we come into this area, we try and look at it as an area of reflection. So looking back, we talk about, you can find out about some of our veterans, what they were up to, what happened to them. Sadly, there's Jake, who doesn't make it. But on the wall there, we've got interviews there with a number of those veterans as they also look back and think, you know, what did they do it for? And we purposely end, this whip that comes from Belsen will be on display just as you're leaving. And one of the important things we felt here, we had some veterans who were at Belsen, and the whip was actually picked up by a young Royal Tank Regiment officer called Cartnell. It was used at the Nuremberg war trials, and when he gave it to the museum in the 1950s, he actually with a letter says, you need to keep this as evidence, because a day will come when people won't believe this actually happened. And I think that's a really powerful thing, because for us, these were gentlemen who were fighting a war that was a war of liberation against something very evil. And a number of them make comment in their videos, you know, it's only at the end there when they saw some of this, they realised what they were being up against.
Wow. Thank you, David. I mean, it's so emotive when you walk around there. I certainly have to come back a few times to get the full benefit of everything. But straight away, we're all lovers of the technology and the tanks, obviously, of course. But doesn't it really come down at the end of the day? You know, it doesn't matter how good your tank was. It's all about the people that crew them. And I think that's the most poignant thing here. Is it's just unbelievable.
Well, I hope that does come across, and we do hope everybody does come along and actually sees this all in the flesh. But for now, can we now hand over to His Royal Highness, the Duke of Kent, who's going to do the formal opening with an address to everybody of this, the World War II Tank Stories exhibition.
Good morning, everybody. In these extraordinary times, like much else in life, we have had to adapt this opening. Under current guidance, I can't be with you at the museum today, nor can those veterans and their families who have assisted us and whom we want to thank. But I do hope that that position will be changing soon, with the Tank Museum due to reopen on the 17th of May. I have been its patron since 1983. I'm also, as it happens, a veteran of the Royal Army Corps with an interest in technology. The Tank Museum has many stories that are dear to me, and amongst its collection are a number of vehicles that I also know. I've seen the museum develop and change to meet the needs of its audiences. But importantly, to continue to tell its key story, that of the Royal Army Corps. The outstanding collection of vehicles has always been, and always will be, the great attraction of the museum, but over recent years, the accent has shifted to the people's story, the human factor in this history, and it's their stories which we now want to display. From looking at those who served in the very first tanks, those who actually made the vehicles, and the more recent experiences of the Army Corps in Afghanistan, and now with the completion of these Second World War displays. For these new displays, the museum has interviewed some more veterans, so their first-hand experiences can be shared. Sadly, some of those veterans are no longer with us, but we hope their families and friends can reflect on and enjoy this exhibition as part of their legacy. Like many people watching, I hope to be able to visit the museum again in reality. For now, I would like to thank all those who have contributed to and made the exhibition possible. And I now have great pleasure in declaring the new Tank Museum exhibition open.
So we hope you got to see there. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour around some of this new World War II exhibition. And if you're particularly interested in some of those veteran stories, can I recommend you have a look on our online shop website, because there's some great stories there. Jock Watts, David Render's stories, we've got a number of them, including the book, we're going to talk to one of the people, Ernest Clark's memoir as well. So those first-hand accounts, please do have a look there and see if you fancy any of those ones as well. And of course, anything bought from our online shop helps the museum, so really worth doing. So we're now going to talk to some of the veterans and their families, and the first veteran I think we're going to be talking to is Bill Wright. I don't know if Bill can hear us at the moment.
Hello David.
Good
yes,
to see you.
Can hear you.
You can hear us. Good to see you there, Bill. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we had a little chat earlier in the week, and I just kind of wanted to ask you, you know, you're a man that literally went ashore in pretty much the first wave on D-Day. What does it...
Well, the second wave.
Second wave, okay. So what's it...
About 10 o'clock.
What's it feel like to be a man that was involved in probably one of the greatest days in European history?
Well, we did know we were making history, and of course that was a great moral booster. But the main trouble was we were all extremely seasick, because the sea, if you remember, was still very rough from the gale the day before. But as soon as we got ashore, we were all right and we could get on with it then.
Can I follow that up with another question then? Because when we talked as well, do you think that your experiences back then from the Second World War, did they affect you and the rest of your life?
Oh yes, very much so. In my particular case, they changed the whole course of my career. Before the war, when I was still at school, I was going to be an engineer and join the family firm. But the war gave me time to really think about what I wanted to do with my life. And I changed course completely and went into forestry.
And was that something because you liked the outdoors? You liked, you know, what was the reason there?
I think it was like a lot of people. It showed me a much wider aspect of life. Different places, different countries, different people. I just wanted to be part of the bigger overall post-war picture, I think.
And I know you and your family have visited the museum a number of times, but do you think these stories we tell here are important stories? I know, you know, it's your story and your family's story, but do you think these are stories that should be still told?
Very much so. I was enormously impressed with your tour of the new gallery, doing exactly that, keeping alive those personal stories which otherwise would be completely forgotten. You can have as many official histories as you like, and divisions moving here and generals doing that, but it's the chap on the ground that actually does it in the end. And you brought that to mind wonderfully well. I look forward very much to seeing it in the flesh sometime.
And I've got to say this to you, Bill, you know, I was just so impressed that when someone recently, we won't mention names, wrote something about World War II you disagreed with, the fact that you were able to write us an article to correct him was fantastic, that you're still there to be able to do things like that. You know, the first-hand man, actually, you saw it differently.
Yes, and I think as the years pass, of course, those misconceptions creep in more and more. So it's so important for people like you and the museum to actually show people what really happened.
Bill, I was wondering if I may ask a question. I mean, one of the reasons, the many reasons I joined the armed forces in the first place was reading stories about gentlemen such as yourself and the inspiration it gave me. Would you have any advice for the younger soldier who followed in your path, anything that they could take forward with them into the future? You have to keep it clean, by the way.
What I think is so encouraging is to see the young soldiers nowadays. They're just like we were. They're just as keen. They know a great deal more about technology than we did. But I'm always enormously impressed when I meet young soldiers today, and to try and appreciate the difficulties they have compared with us. Being a soldier in peacetime can be very challenging in all sorts of ways. There are challenges to soldiers far beyond battlefield experience, and I think they do a wonderful job.
Bill, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us today. And we really look forward to seeing you and your family down here again. So thank you so much for coming along and joining us for this online opening. It's such a shame you couldn't be here in person, but we hope to see you in the future.
Well, thanks very much, David. I'll certainly be there.
Thank you. Now we're going to move on now to another veteran, Ernest Slarks. Ernest, I hope you can hear us. Is that okay?
Yes.
Ernest, good to see you. Now, Ernest, you've been down to the museum as well, haven't you? You've come round before.
Yes, quite a lot of times.
You have indeed. So, can I ask you, when we talked earlier, you were a radio operator on a Sherman. Yes. One of the things about that was you were saying you had a number of near scrapes during your service career. You came out with a line to me saying you thought someone was watching out for you.
Yes, yeah. I feel that very strongly, yeah.
And did you think that affected your later career choices and what you did in your later life?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Because you were saying to me as well about your doing your training when you were still out in Germany to become a Methodist minister.
Well, not minister, a lay preacher.
Lay preacher, I apologise. Tell us about that.
Well, I was about to start the course, the big course, when I got the calling up papers. So I had to put it to one side. But a strange thing, in Fellingbostel, was the last place I was in, I went to the Tockage and the man there was a churchman. And I mentioned that I had just got to start. Oh, he said, we can do it here by a correspondence course. So I did the Old Testament correspondence course and got the first part of the training finished. So I had to do the rest when I came out of the army. But it's strange that he should be there in that place at that time.
And you've only just given up going on the circuit, haven't you?
Yeah, not many years ago. I did another 4 years because I felt I got a lot more to say. When I was younger, I was very, very shy. And the idea of preaching in a pulpit to 100 or 200 people was it's impossible. I was so shy, I couldn't do it. But I was persuaded to. But one night, I went to church one night and the preacher hadn't turned up. And the steward came along the aisle and he said, Ernie, can you start the service? No arrangement, no plans, I just stood it. And somehow I came out of that pulpit after having did a sermon as well. And I wondered, well, how did I do that? It wasn't me, definitely not me. Surely that's a sign that I've got to do this, whether I like it or not. I didn't really want to do it because I didn't feel I was good enough for the job. But I did, and I did 70 years as a local preacher.
So Ernest, taking you back, sorry.
I just want to say, it was interesting, you said you were in Fellingbostel, so one day I'd love to meet you in person and talk about the best bars. We were based in Fellingbostel as well, and then see how the area's changed. So that'd be really interesting. But you were a radio operator. Now I know obviously from my time as a radio operator, did you feel like the whole world was passing you by because you're forever, you can't really see a great deal when you're in there.
Oh yes, that is the point. I remember being in Goodwood in the middle of that long when the Germans opened up on that ridge and just picked one after the other, and I didn't realise how bad it was until I got back and read the story. And I thought, golly, I was in the middle of that and didn't know it. So there's some compensation being inside, I suppose.
And I know when you've come down here, you very kindly spoke to some of our audience that were here at the time, and you stood in front of the Firefly and explained to them what it was like. Can I ask you as well, do you think we should be carrying on telling these stories? Is it time to park that bit of history, or should we carry on doing what you were doing, telling them what it was like?
Well, definitely. I mean, young people should know about these things. That was one reason why I wrote me a life story twice. This one I got now was only another one, and I wrote it particularly for the grandchildren because I knew nothing about my parents. So I thought, well, I've got to tell them what it was like in the 1920s and 30s when I was born. And I think it's important that young people know these things.
And you, I saw that lovely picture your son sent us of you holding one of our inflatable 17-pounder rounds.
Yes, I've lost it. I've put it round. I put it somewhere safe. It was so safe I can't find it. Oh, they were about 36 inches long.
Yeah, and you remember
And
actually
70
loading those?
And we carried about 70 or 80 of those around the turret.
Amazing. Well, look, Ernest, thank you so much again for joining us, and thank you for your son being there as well. And we hope again we see you both down here yet again at the museum. You'll be very welcome to come round. Thank you so much for that.
I hope so too, yeah.
And we'll see you again in the future. Now we're going to move on now to some of the other families whose people whose their stories are represented, and we're going to start with talking to Robert Vorks, who his father Peter was the story with the compass. So Robert, are you there? Can you hear us okay?
I can, yes, David, yeah.
So thanks very much for joining us. And one of the questions I'd start with you to say is, how much did you know of your father's wartime service when you were growing up?
Well, when I was young, not very much. The whole experience was clearly quite emotional for him, and it gradually came out, and so by the time our own, I'd been and finished my own time in the Royal Tank Regiment, and when our boys were teenagers, he was then happy to go back to the Arras battlefield and tell us about it, and tell us about the tremendously sort of emotionally charged aspects. And if I say that he, you focused clearly on these very first few days of the war, really, and the whole business of fighting was brand new to them all. And then having got back to UK after, most had gone through Dunkirk and in his case through Cherbourg, back to UK after a very few months of training and reorganizing, they went back out and fought for years in the desert, and then he went to Haifa to Staff College and for a few months, and then went back with 7 Armoured Brigade and fought all the way through Italy. So it was just years and years of warfare. As a sort of Cold War soldier, it's extraordinary to contemplate that. But in all of that fighting, it was a few days in and following Arras, which had, I think, the biggest impact on his life, and had registered big time, as you can imagine. On the day of the battle, he and his crew were up early morning, getting things positioned. Had to make sure that the tank companies were at the start line. The HR was somewhere around midday, so it was later, but they'd been working at it all morning, and then all afternoon they had a lot of being shot at and shooting back, and also seeing a huge number of casualties. He saw his commanding officer dead on the battlefield. It must have been quite a terrifying experience. And when they regrouped at a rendezvous behind the action, by about 9 o'clock in the evening, and being 21st of May, it was still light, and the light was fading. And then they had a set 2 with some German tanks that rolled out of the dusk to everyone's surprise. And at that point, he found that he had actually expended a whole bomb load of ammunition for their little light 6B tank. So imagine how exhausted they were. And then you've explained a lot of his story as he made his way down to the Somme and swam across the Somme. But they had about a 65-kilometer road march in the little tank, clanking their way down and bumping into German transports and goodness knows what, and then out on foot for another 15, 20 kilometers. So the exhaustion must have been total. And then you realize he was 23 and Bob Burrows, his driver, had just had his 21st birthday a few weeks before. So these were young chaps doing this, and it was all amazing. And that personal thing is what has really come out through the display, and I'm tremendously impressed.
That's really good. Sorry.
Robert, I'm just wondering, what was the idea behind you joining the Royal Tank Regiment? What made you think that was, the part of the army for you? Was it purely these stories and the legacy, or?
I decided as a schoolboy that I wanted to be an engineer, and but it somehow was put to me, how about doing a short service commission first, and that appealed, and well, you might as well do it in your father's regiment. So I joined the 4th Tanks, and after 22 years, I left that and went into civilian life. So it was, that there was something to follow there for me.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope we see you down here again, and I'm really pleased that you're pleased with the display. So thank you very much there.
Thank you, David. Well done.
Jeff Simpson, sorry, I'm just saying this loudly all the time because you'll suddenly appear on my screen. Jeff, good to see
Hello.
you. Now, Jeff, you're the nephew of Jake Wardrop, the soldier. I've mentioned a number of his diary entries as we've been going round. Now, I know, Jeff, you know what a great story that diary is, what wonderful things are in there. Can I ask you, though, you've given us those diaries. What did you feel yourself about being the custodian of such a wonderful piece of history?
It's always been, a privilege to look after them, really. They've been available. The first part that was written up when it was at Bovington that finished when they came back from Italy, that's been in our family since I can remember, since he was killed. The rest of the diaries that from the coming back to Britain and then training for D-Day and then all the way through Northwest Europe, they weren't discovered till Jack's sister died in 1995, when moving a wardrobe meant that this package fell out from behind, and there were all these notebooks that nobody knew had been there. So that was quite a surprise, and that was something I was very pleased to get written up. It was always the intention of the family, right back to Jack's mum and my grandma, that they should go to the tank regiment. But when things have quite a personal connection to you, so it's been a bit of a job to let them go. So we finally managed to do that after all these years, and I'm really pleased that they've gone to the tank museum. I can't think of anywhere else more suitable, really, to look after these, so that the stories can continue to be read and can be used in exhibitions like the one you've just given us a tour around.
And of course, you never knew him, but Jake was a bit of a character, wasn't he?
Well, everybody says so, and certainly some of the stories that he's willing to relate would indicate so. I sometimes wonder if there were other stories that maybe didn't make it into the diaries, but the ones that are in there are interesting enough.
Jeff, I just wanted to say, one of my biggest regrets, I think, in life, actually, my grandfather was a prisoner of war, and I never really sort of got much of the story behind it. So I just personally want to thank you for making all of us aware of all this, because, to me, it's so critically important. So just thank you, Jeff.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure. It's been a labour of love, really, to make sure from deciphering his handwriting to typing it up and then to get it in a format that can finally go to the museum and you can make use of it for the benefit of others.
Well, I hope, Jeff, you'll be able to come down and you'll see we've got lots of his excerpts around and a really lovely piece on him at the end. And all I'd say, I keep saying it, I recommend everyone read that diary. It's such a wonderful, it brings it to life. And it also, I would argue, it just shows he's so good at describing his fellow man, the love they all seem to have between them of what they're doing and what they believe they're fighting for, and just the humour. I mean, the humour in the things he comes out with as well. It's very, such a great read. So I can only echo that. Thank you so much for handing those diaries across, and we hope to see you here again soon.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Hope to be there soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Now, we're going to talk now to Catherine Stanton, who is the daughter of David Render, who the story we saw earlier, David lost his great friend Harry Heinen. Now, Catherine, I know we spoke on the phone. One of the things I just wanted to ask you was, you haven't actually read, have you, your dad's fairly recent, we've got the book here, his tank action book, but you were saying to me you haven't actually read it.
No, I haven't.
And what was the reason?
I heard so many of his stories that I found it really, I just haven't been able to read it. But my husband has read it and said you very much hear my father's voice coming out throughout the whole of the book. So maybe because he passed away 4 years ago now. So maybe now I'm in a better place to read the book and hear his voice again.
And have you found out, dare I say that, because again, we talked earlier in the week, but that idea of when people go, suddenly other people appear that that have talked about him, that have met him. Has that been a revelation to you in any way?
Yes, I would agree with that. I've actually really found out how respected and very much loved my father was. And I mean, he's left a massive hole to me, and I think he left a massive hole with many other people as well, which is wonderful. It's very heartwarming for me. I like to know how much he's loved as much as I loved him.
Catherine, may I say, I had the great honour and pleasure of doing some filming with your father a few years ago. And I have to say, we had many hours off camera, I hasten to add, because there were certain things he was sharing that he didn't want on camera. But I have to say, I was so warm to him. His humour just absolutely shone through. And it was just, I do regret sorely not being able to spend more time with him and go out for a drink and everything. So, yeah, an incredible man, Catherine.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Actually, he wouldn't have had a drink with you. He'd have sat there drinking water.
He did actually tell me this, yes.
He was never a drinker, unlike the rest of us.
Especially in lockdown, yeah.
Very true. But yeah, he had so many stories, and army-wise, in many ways, I used to hear them all so often that I know it sounds silly, but you became a little bit, I don't know, nonplussed by it is probably the best word to use. I didn't really realise just how brave he'd been, and just really what they all went through, and just seeing how you've shown your exhibition, listening to the story of the diaries as well. How amazing. I mean, really, all of these stories, and remembering that these boys were 23, 21. I mean, it's crazy to think that they went through so much, and it's very humbling, I feel.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Catherine, and we hope you do come down here in person as soon as you can and have a proper look around.
Oh, very much would like to. I very much would like to. I'd like my sons to see it. I know they'd be very proud to see Papa. The stuff that you have there from him, that would be, they would like that very much. I know that. I might be in tears, but
yeah, you won't be the only one. Thank you very much for that. Now we're going to move on to, I think we've got Diane Woodhouse there. And Diane, hello, we've met before.
Hello.
down here at the museum. And
Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, for joining us. Now, your dad's story, we didn't really see it here in the sense, but it's on our Normandy section. Dear old Charlie, he tells us about watching this famous engagement. He was on the hillside watching at Villers-Bocage, where he sees this German tank commander knock out lots of Allied tanks. But I really wanted to ask you, because I remember you shared with us that story of when you went back, was it to Belgium or was it Holland with your dad? And you were going back there, and I remember being moved at the time. Do you mind sharing that story again about you going back with Charlie?
Well, we went a couple of times actually. So we went to the Normandy beaches, you know, to Arromanches. And then what we did was we actually followed the war diary, which is an excellent piece of information actually. So we were able to follow that. And anyway, we ended up in Holland because while the troops were waiting to cross the Rhine, because of the winter, they were billeted in sort of Dutch homes, you know, with Dutch families. And the family he and his tank crew were billeted with were a family called Honnings, and he never forgot them. He never forgot their kindness. They shared their rations with the family so that they could have sort of food together, and he never ever forgot them. So when we said to him, look, you know, we're thinking of doing this trip, where would you like to go? And he said he would love to go back to Gravendicht, just to look at it, just to see the development really, you know, post-war and that. Anyway, so sort of very, not really going with very great expectation, we arrived at this village and we sort of stopped and had a coffee, and just very randomly, there was the postman, and we just, you know, I don't even know why we asked him, but of course he spoke perfect English. And my dad, being my dad, just sort of said, do you know a family called Honnings that live here? And he sort of thought about it for a moment, dashed off on his bicycle. We were then just wandering around, and we found actually what was a Jewish cemetery. So we thought, well, while we're here, let's just do a little bit of sort of historic research, if you like. And across from this cemetery were a new row of houses, bungalows actually, and there was this lady furiously cleaning her windows and watching us, thinking we were very, very strange people wandering around in this Jewish cemetery. So again, my dad, being my dad, decided he'd like to have a cigarette, so he just sort of wandered over to this lady and said, we're looking for a family here called Honnings. Whereupon I thought he was going to give her a heart attack, because she then bashed on her chest and said, it's me. So it was just an amazing, amazing experience. And then the postman came round the corner on his bike and said, oh, you found her. So we then had this sort of really bizarre, really, hour sitting in her living room, drinking tea, while she showed us all of these photographs from the whole tank crew that had been billeted with the family. And well, she cried, my dad cried. It was just absolutely amazing. And he was always so fond. That was his one story that he used to tell when I was a child about staying with this family. And for them then to meet up, I mean, he must have been late 80s by then, and she was of a similar age. After all those years to meet, it was just so emotional, and it was just wonderful.
Thank you so much for sharing that one, because I think these are what I, you know, we talk about in the galleries, personal stories, but you're the family. It's your family story as well, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. No, it is, it's amazing. Can I just touch on as well, because Ernest mentioned about Fallingbostel, and you did as well. And in actual fact, my dad was part of the, because it was Sea Squadron, 18th Royal Irish Hussars, they actually liberated what was the prisoner of war camp. And the story there, because obviously they were going on further into Germany, his story of that was that they offered, their tank crew offered their rations to some of the prisoners of war there when they were talking to them, because, you know, clearly they were a little bit malnourished, and they wouldn't accept the rations from them, even though they were hungry, because they said to them that they needed that food to carry on, to continue the fight into Germany. And he always remembered that, you know. Yeah, it was lovely.
Thank you again so much for joining us and telling us that. And I know you've been down a few times in the last year and that, so please do say hello when you come down again.
We will do. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana.
Thank you. And finally, Richard Parker is joining us, and you're actually the grandson, aren't you, of Alf Longstaff, who, again, we have a number of displays. And I know yourself, I know your sister's been down. We were able to show some of the early parts where Alf appears, but you knew him, you knew Alf as he grew into older age?
Very much so, yeah. From being a young boy, it was a fantastic role model to grow up with, and spent many a weekend listening to the stories of war and what he did with the regiment, and spent time with him in the garden discussing different things that he'd done in Africa and his time on the run in Italy. So yeah, I got to hear all sorts of stories and experiences that he went through with the rest of the family. We had fond memories of chatting to him about all the different experiences during the war.
Richard, we can just about hear you. Sorry, slight technical differences there. Let's try again sort of on that one. We just heard about that, but the thing that got me with Alf's story, he really was a survivor, wasn't he? I hate to say it, I've got... Can you hear me?
No, I'm afraid we've...
I hate to say it, I've got a funny feeling we're going to have to end that one there, because we can't quite... We're not sure if the bandwidth is quite up to it. Does that... don't think we can really quite hear on that, so... No? Okay, I do apologise there. So I don't think we can quite hear that properly, but thank you. Can I just finish off by saying to all those family members, Ernest, Bill, our veterans who joined us today, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope we do see you all down here when COVID's over. You can come and have a proper look, and we're not doing it this way by live stream. So
yeah,
thanks.
absolutely, yeah.
So we're going to say goodbye to our guests there, and then to our audience out there, thank you again for joining us for this live stream. I hope you've enjoyed yourself
Absolutely
as well.
Brilliant. And again, David, thank you for showing me around. To all the veterans, thank you so much for your stories. We all think it's so critically important to remember all this. Don't forget, of course, the museum is opening again on Monday, the 17th of May, after a long closure period. So please come down and support them again. And again, don't forget about Patreon for the museum. Critically important to help them out.
Yeah, and again, we say this all the way along. Please, what we're really after for all of you when we do open, not just us as a museum, but all the museums out there, please do engage again, because we're going to need you to survive into the future to tell these really important stories that we think are so important to share with everybody. So thank you so much for joining us today. We hope we see you there. If you are going to try and make a visit, do check our website first, but we'll be open again from Monday. Again, from both of us and our veterans and the families there, goodbye.
Take care.